Sarah Martinez had never imagined herself in a war zone. At 32, she worked as a medical supply coordinator for a humanitarian organization, spending her days managing inventory and ensuring remote clinics received necessary medications. Her background was in logistics and healthcare administration, not combat or military tactics. She had grown up in a peaceful suburban town in Colorado, studied business in college, and lived a quiet life focused on helping others through her work. When the organization assigned her to oversee medical supply distribution in the conflict-torn region of eastern Balkovia, Sarah viewed it as just another challenging assignment. The area had been experiencing civil unrest for months, but her role seemed straightforward and safe. She would work from a secured compound, coordinate with local healthcare workers, and ensure medical supplies reached those who needed them most. The compound housed several international aid workers, local staff, and was supposedly protected by a small security detail. Sarah arrived in the region during what appeared to be a calm period. The compound sat on a hillside overlooking a valley dotted with small villages. The facility included living quarters, offices, a communications center, and a large warehouse filled with medical supplies. The security team consisted of just 4 guards who seemed more focused on keeping curious locals away than preparing for any serious threats. Most of the other aid workers had been in the region for months and assured Sarah that while the situation was tense, direct attacks on humanitarian facilities were rare. During her first weeks, Sarah established routines and built relationships with local healthcare workers. She discovered that many of the small clinics in surrounding villages were barely functioning due to supply shortages. Her logistical skills proved valuable as she developed efficient distribution networks, ensuring antibiotics reached a clinic treating wounded civilians one day, and surgical supplies arrived at a field hospital the next. She worked 12-hour days, driven by the knowledge that her organizational abilities directly saved lives. The local team quickly grew to respect Sarah's dedication and competence. She learned basic phrases in the local language, understood the complex political dynamics affecting supply routes, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. However, none of her planning involved armed combat. She had never held a weapon, received any military training, or considered herself capable of violence. Her strength lay in problem-solving, coordination, and maintaining calm under administrative pressure. Sarah noticed increasing tension in the region as weeks passed. Radio communications mentioned more frequent skirmishes between government forces and rebel groups. Some supply routes became unreliable and local staff seemed more nervous. The security team leader, a former military officer named Victor, began conducting more frequent perimeter checks and suggested establishing better defensive positions around the compound. Sarah supported these precautions but remained focused on her primary mission of medical supply distribution. One evening, while reviewing supply requests from village clinics, Sarah received disturbing news from Victor. Intelligence reports indicated that a large rebel force was moving through the area, potentially targeting international facilities they viewed as supporting the government. The rebels had attacked similar compounds in neighboring regions, seizing supplies and taking hostages. Victor recommended immediate evacuation, but Sarah knew that leaving would cut off medical supplies to dozens of villages where people were dying from treatable conditions. The compound's communications equipment allowed Sarah to contact her organization's headquarters, but the nearest military support was days away. Local government forces were engaged in heavy fighting elsewhere and couldn't provide protection. Sarah faced an impossible choice: abandon the mission and let countless civilians suffer without medical care, or remain and risk capture or death. She thought about the children she had seen in village clinics, the wounded civilians depending on antibiotics, and the healthcare workers who trusted her to maintain supply lines. After consulting with Victor and the local team, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. They would remain operational for as long as possible while preparing defensive measures. Victor began training staff in basic security procedures, identifying defensive positions within the compound, and preparing emergency protocols. Sarah continued coordinating medical supply deliveries, knowing each shipment might be her last. She had no idea that within days, her logistical mind and natural leadership abilities would be tested in ways she never imagined possible. The stage was set for an ordinary woman to face extraordinary circumstances. Sarah Martinez, armed only with determination, and an unshakable commitment to her humanitarian mission, was about to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. The compound's isolated location, limited defenses, and essential mission created a situation where conventional military support would be impossible, and survival would depend entirely on the courage and ingenuity of those present. The first signs of danger came through crackling radio transmissions at dawn. Victor burst into Sarah's office with news that changed everything. A heavily armed rebel force of approximately 30 fighters was advancing toward their position. Local intelligence contacts reported the group was specifically targeting international facilities, believing they were supporting government forces. The rebels had attacked 2 similar compounds in the past month, seizing supplies and equipment before disappearing back into the mountainous terrain. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she processed the information, but her mind immediately shifted into problem-solving mode. She had dealt with supply chain disruptions, medical emergencies, and administrative crises, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The compound housed 12 people: Sarah, Victor, 2 other security guards, 3 international aid workers, and 5 local staff members. Their defensive capabilities were minimal, consisting of basic security equipment and limited ammunition. Victor explained their tactical situation with military precision. The compound's location on a hillside provided some advantages for observation and defense, but also made them visible from multiple approaches. The main building was solid concrete construction that could withstand small arms fire, but the warehouse and other structures offered little protection. Their communication equipment could reach the outside world, but the nearest military support was at least 48 hours away, assuming they could even respond to the crisis. As Sarah absorbed this information, her humanitarian training kicked in. She immediately began evacuating non-essential personnel and coordinating with village contacts to warn them about the approaching danger. However, she faced a devastating realization. Abandoning the compound would leave 6 village clinics without critical medical supplies within days. Dozens of wounded civilians were receiving treatment that depended on antibiotics, surgical supplies, and other medications stored in their warehouse. The local staff presented Sarah with heartbreaking intelligence from their village networks. Government forces were engaged in heavy fighting in 3 different sectors and could not spare troops for compound protection. International peacekeeping forces were committed elsewhere and unavailable. Most devastating of all, the rebel group was known for executing foreign aid workers they captured, viewing them as legitimate military targets supporting their enemies. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Rather than evacuating immediately, she would coordinate a limited evacuation of non-essential personnel while maintaining a skeleton crew to continue medical supply operations for as long as possible. 3 international aid workers and 2 local staff members would leave immediately, with the most critical supplies that could be transported quickly. Sarah, Victor, 2 security guards, and 3 essential local staff would remain to maintain operations. This decision revealed something remarkable about Sarah's character. Under extreme pressure, her humanitarian instincts and leadership abilities emerged stronger than her natural fear. She began organizing the compound's defense with the same methodical approach she used for medical supply logistics. Every resource was inventoried, every defensive position evaluated, and every possible scenario considered. Victor watched with growing amazement as this civilian administrator displayed natural tactical thinking. Sarah's background in supply chain management proved unexpectedly valuable for defensive planning. She understood resource allocation, contingency planning, and operational efficiency. Working with Victor, she developed defensive strategies that maximized their limited resources. The warehouse containing medical supplies became a secondary fallback position. Communication equipment was secured in the most protected area, and supply caches were distributed throughout the compound. As the day progressed, Sarah coordinated what might be their final medical supply deliveries, while simultaneously preparing for an attack. Village healthcare workers were warned about the situation and given emergency supply caches that could sustain critical operations for several days. Sarah's local contacts provided updated intelligence about rebel movement, creating an information network that proved invaluable for defensive preparations. The compound's remaining team worked with focused intensity, knowing they had limited time. Victor and his security team prepared defensive positions, checked weapons and ammunition, and established communication protocols. Sarah organized medical supplies for potential casualties, secured important documents and communication codes, and maintained contact with her organization's headquarters. Every decision was made with the understanding that their survival might depend on preparation completed in the next few hours. As evening approached, the tension became almost unbearable. Radio reports indicated the rebel force was approximately 12 hours away from their position. Sarah spent her final peaceful hours reviewing defensive plans with Victor, ensuring everyone understood their roles, and making final supply deliveries to village clinics. She wrote letters to her family, not knowing if she would survive the coming confrontation. Victor pulled Sarah aside for a conversation that would prove prophetic. He told her that in his military experience, leadership under extreme pressure revealed people's true character. Some individuals with extensive training crumbled when faced with real danger, while others with no combat experience discovered extraordinary courage and capability. He had observed Sarah's calm decision-making, natural tactical thinking, and ability to inspire others under pressure. Victor suspected she possessed qualities that would be crucial in the coming fight. Sarah spent her last quiet moments looking out over the valley, thinking about the villages depending on their medical supplies and the people who would suffer if they abandoned their mission. She had never wanted to be a hero or engage in combat, but circumstances had created a situation where ordinary courage would be tested in extraordinary ways. Tomorrow would determine whether her humanitarian convictions and natural leadership abilities could overcome her complete lack of combat training. The attack began before sunrise with the distant sound of engines echoing through the valley. Sarah was already awake, having spent most of the night reviewing defensive plans and monitoring radio communications. Victor's voice crackled through the compound's intercom system, confirming what everyone feared. Multiple vehicles were approaching their position from two different directions. The rebel force had arrived earlier than expected and was larger than initial intelligence had suggested. Sarah's heart pounded as she took her position in the main building's communication center, but her voice remained steady as she coordinated with the defensive team. Her role was supposed to be purely supportive, maintaining communication with the outside world and coordinating medical care for any casualties. However, as the situation developed, her natural leadership abilities and tactical thinking would prove far more valuable than anyone anticipated. Victor positioned his small security team at strategic points around the compound, but the mathematical reality was overwhelming. 4 lightly armed guards against an estimated 30 to 40 well-equipped fighters made conventional defense nearly impossible. The compound's layout provided some advantages, with the main building offering solid cover and elevated positions providing good visibility. But their ammunition and defensive resources were severely limited. The first rebel vehicles appeared on the access road leading to the compound just as dawn light began illuminating the valley. Through binoculars, Sarah could see pickup trucks mounted with heavy weapons and armed fighters moving with military precision. These were not undisciplined militia members, but experienced combatants who had clearly attacked similar targets before. Their approach demonstrated tactical knowledge and coordination that made the situation even more desperate. Sarah's administrative background had given her experience managing crisis communications, and she immediately began coordinating with multiple outside contacts. Her organization's headquarters received detailed situation reports. Local intelligence contacts provided real-time information about rebel movements, and village networks were warned to prepare for potential spillover violence. This communication web would prove crucial as the situation developed. The rebels' first move was a psychological warfare tactic designed to force surrender without costly fighting. A vehicle approached under a white flag, and their leader demanded immediate evacuation of all international personnel and surrender of all medical supplies. Sarah listened to Victor's translation of the demands with growing anger rather than fear. These supplies were destined for village clinics treating wounded civilians, and surrendering them would condemn dozens of people to preventable deaths. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone in the compound, including herself. Rather than immediately refusing the demands, she requested permission to speak directly with the rebel leader. Victor initially resisted, concerned for her safety, but Sarah insisted that her negotiation skills might buy them time or find a peaceful resolution. Her humanitarian background had given her experience dealing with difficult situations and hostile individuals. The conversation with the rebel leader revealed the complex dynamics driving the conflict. The rebel commander, a former military officer, named Kozlov, believed that international aid organizations were providing cover for government military operations. He had witnessed airstrikes guided by intelligence allegedly gathered from humanitarian facilities, and several of his fighters had been killed in operations they believed were supported by international personnel. Sarah's response demonstrated remarkable courage and tactical thinking. Rather than simply denying these allegations, she acknowledged the complexity of the situation, while explaining the purely humanitarian nature of their mission. She provided specific examples of medical supplies delivered to villages, showing how their operations saved civilian lives regardless of political affiliation. Most importantly, she offered to allow rebel representatives to inspect their supplies and operations to verify their humanitarian claims. This negotiation bought valuable time while revealing something crucial about the rebel forces' composition and motivation. Through careful questioning, Sarah learned that Kozlov's fighters were primarily motivated by specific grievances rather than general anti-international sentiment. Several had family members who had died from treatable medical conditions due to supply shortages, creating a complex situation where both sides were actually trying to help the same civilian population. Victor watched Sarah's negotiation with growing amazement. Her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, think strategically about complex problems, and communicate effectively with hostile individuals suggested capabilities that went far beyond normal civilian training. She was essentially conducting diplomatic negotiations while under direct threat, using skills that many military officers never develop. However, the negotiation also revealed the impossible nature of their situation. Kozlov explained that his superiors had ordered him to seize all international facilities in the region, regardless of their actual activities. Political pressures and military dynamics beyond his control meant that he could not simply withdraw, even if convinced of their humanitarian intentions. The attack would proceed, but Sarah's negotiation had provided valuable intelligence about rebel capabilities and intentions. As the negotiation concluded, Sarah made a final request that demonstrated her commitment to the humanitarian mission. She asked for permission to complete one final medical supply delivery to a village clinic treating wounded children, arguing that this would prove their genuine humanitarian intentions. Kozlov agreed to a 2-hour delay, which Sarah and Victor immediately recognized as an opportunity to improve their defensive preparations. During these crucial hours, Sarah coordinated the most important supply delivery of her career, while simultaneously preparing for combat. Village healthcare workers received emergency medical supplies that would sustain critical operations for days, and local intelligence contacts provided updated information about rebel positions and capabilities. Sarah had essentially transformed a humanitarian crisis into a tactical opportunity. As the deadline approached, Sarah found herself in a position she had never imagined. Her negotiation had demonstrated that she possessed natural diplomatic and leadership abilities that could influence dangerous situations. However, the fundamental conflict remained unresolved and combat seemed inevitable. Sarah was about to discover whether her humanitarian convictions and tactical thinking could survive the reality of armed confrontation. By the 3rd hour of fighting, Sarah had completely abandoned her original role as a communication coordinator and evolved into something entirely unexpected, a tactical leader whose decisions were directly influencing the battle's outcome. Victor found himself deferring to her assessments more frequently, recognizing that her analytical abilities and real-time intelligence coordination were proving more valuable than conventional military experience in their unique situation. The compound's defense had settled into a deadly pattern where rebel attacks met increasingly sophisticated resistance. Sarah's village intelligence network continued providing advance warning of rebel movements, while her tactical innovations forced attackers into positions where Victor's limited security team could inflict maximum damage. However, the most significant development was Sarah's growing confidence in direct combat, situations that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Sarah's transformation accelerated when rebel fighters attempted their most ambitious assault yet, a coordinated attack on multiple compound positions designed to overwhelm defensive resources and create breaches that could be exploited by follow-up forces. This complex maneuver required defenders to make split-second decisions about resource allocation and tactical priorities. Sarah found herself not just coordinating defensive responses, but actively directing specific combat actions. The multi-pronged assault began with diversionary attacks on the compound's eastern perimeter, designed to draw defensive fire away from the main attack on the western approach. Sarah immediately recognized this tactic from her logistical experience with complex supply chain disruptions that used similar misdirection strategies. She coordinated a defensive response that maintained minimal forces on the diversionary attacks while concentrating firepower where it would be most effective. Sarah's most crucial contribution came when she identified a fatal flaw in the rebel attack plan. Their coordination depended on radio communication between attack groups, but Sarah had been monitoring their frequencies throughout the engagement. She realized that jamming their communications at the critical moment would turn their coordinated attack into a series of isolated assaults that could be defeated individually. This insight required her to move from passive coordination to active tactical intervention. Working with Victor, Sarah implemented a communication jamming strategy using equipment originally designed for coordinating medical supply deliveries. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and rebels would adapt their tactics. Too late, and their coordinated assault would succeed before jamming could disrupt it. Sarah's experience with complex logistical timing proved invaluable for coordinating this technical intervention with kinetic defensive actions. The jamming succeeded beyond their expectations, turning a potentially overwhelming coordinated assault into a series of confused individual attacks that Victor's positioned defenders could handle effectively. However, the most significant development was Sarah's decision to leave her protected position and actively participate in defensive fighting. Victor initially protested, but Sarah argued that their survival required maximum utilization of all available personnel, regardless of training background. Sarah's first direct combat engagement came when rebel fighters breached the compound's secondary perimeter and advanced toward the main building. Her position in the communication center provided an elevated view of the approach route, making her ideally positioned to direct defensive fire. However, when one of Victor's guards was wounded and forced to abandon his position, Sarah made a split-second decision that changed everything. She moved to fill the gap herself. Armed with a rifle she had never fired before that day, Sarah found herself in direct combat with experienced fighters who had been expecting to face only professional security personnel. Her complete lack of combat training actually proved advantageous in some ways, as she approached tactical problems without preconceptions about conventional military doctrine. Her defensive position covered a critical approach route that rebels needed to control in order to advance toward their primary objectives. The engagement that followed revealed something remarkable about Sarah's psychological response to extreme danger. Rather than experiencing panic or hesitation, she found herself becoming more focused and analytical as the situation intensified. Her humanitarian background had prepared her to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, and combat simply represented another form of crisis requiring immediate, effective responses based on available information. Sarah's unconventional approach to defensive fighting proved surprisingly effective against experienced attackers. Her positioning prioritized fields of fire that would inflict maximum casualties on advancing rebels, while providing maximum protection for her own position. She coordinated her defensive fire with Victor's remaining guards to create crossfire zones that made rebel advances extremely costly. Most importantly, she maintained communication coordination, even while directly engaged in combat. The battle reached its climax when Kozlov personally led a final assault designed to break through the compound's remaining defenses and seize the medical supply warehouse. This attack represented the rebels' last opportunity to achieve their objectives before casualties made continued fighting impossible. Sarah found herself directly opposed to the rebel leader whose forces had killed several local healthcare workers and threatened to cut off medical supplies to dozens of villages. Sarah's response to this final assault demonstrated how completely she had evolved from civilian administrator to combat leader. She coordinated defensive positions, directed tactical fire, and made real-time decisions about resource allocation while maintaining communication with outside contacts who were providing intelligence about rebel reinforcements and escape routes. Her multitasking abilities and crisis management experience proved invaluable for managing complex tactical situations. The turning point came when Sarah identified an opportunity that Victor, focused on immediate defensive concerns, had missed. Rebel casualties and communication disruption had created a situation where a well-timed counterattack could potentially break their remaining cohesion and force a general withdrawal. However, this opportunity required rapid coordination between defensive positions and precise timing that would be extremely difficult to achieve. Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the engagement. She volunteered to personally coordinate and participate in a counterattack against rebel positions. Victor initially refused, but Sarah's demonstrated tactical abilities and intimate knowledge of compound layout and rebel positions made her arguments compelling. The counterattack would represent the culmination of her transformation from humanitarian coordinator to combat leader. By the third hour of fighting, Sarah had completely abandoned her original role as a communication coordinator and evolved into something entirely unexpected, a tactical leader whose decisions were directly influencing the battle's outcome. Victor found himself deferring to her assessments more frequently, recognizing that her analytical abilities and real-time intelligence coordination were proving more valuable than conventional military experience in their unique situation. The compound's defense had settled into a deadly pattern where rebel attacks met increasingly sophisticated resistance. Sarah's village intelligence network continued providing advance warning of rebel movements, while her tactical innovations forced attackers into positions where Victor's limited security team could inflict maximum damage. However, the most significant development was Sarah's growing confidence in direct combat, situations that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Sarah's transformation accelerated when rebel fighters attempted their most ambitious assault yet, a coordinated attack on multiple compound positions designed to overwhelm defensive resources and create breaches that could be exploited by follow-up forces. This complex maneuver required defenders to make split-second decisions about resource allocation and tactical priorities. Sarah found herself not just coordinating defensive responses, but actively directing specific combat actions. The multi-pronged assault began with diversionary attacks on the compound's eastern perimeter, designed to draw defensive fire away from the main attack on the western approach. Sarah immediately recognized this tactic from her logistical experience with complex supply chain disruptions that used similar misdirection strategies. She coordinated a defensive response that maintained minimal forces on the diversionary attacks while concentrating firepower where it would be most effective. Sarah's most crucial contribution came when she identified a fatal flaw in the rebel attack plan. Their coordination depended on radio communication between attack groups, but Sarah had been monitoring their frequencies throughout the engagement. She realized that jamming their communications at the critical moment would turn their coordinated attack into a series of isolated assaults that could be defeated individually. This insight required her to move from passive coordination to active tactical intervention. Working with Victor, Sarah implemented a communication jamming strategy using equipment originally designed for coordinating medical supply deliveries. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and rebels would adapt their tactics. Too late, and their coordinated assault would succeed before jamming could disrupt it. Sarah's experience with complex logistical timing proved invaluable for coordinating this technical intervention with kinetic defensive actions. The jamming succeeded beyond their expectations, turning a potentially overwhelming coordinated assault into a series of confused individual attacks that Victor's positioned defenders could handle effectively. However, the most significant development was Sarah's decision to leave her protected position and actively participate in defensive fighting. Victor initially protested, but Sarah argued that their survival required maximum utilization of all available personnel, regardless of training background. Sarah's first direct combat engagement came when rebel fighters breached the compound's secondary perimeter and advanced toward the main building. Her position in the communication center provided an elevated view of the approach route, making her ideally positioned to direct defensive fire. However, when one of Victor's guards was wounded and forced to abandon his position, Sarah made a split-second decision that changed everything. She moved to fill the gap herself. Armed with a rifle she had never fired before that day, Sarah found herself in direct combat with experienced fighters who had been expecting to face only professional security personnel. Her complete lack of combat training actually proved advantageous in some ways. As she approached tactical problems without preconceptions about conventional military doctrine, her defensive position covered a critical approach route that rebels needed to control in order to advance toward their primary objectives. The engagement that followed revealed something remarkable about Sarah's psychological response to extreme danger. Rather than experiencing panic or hesitation, she found herself becoming more focused and analytical as the situation intensified. Her humanitarian background had prepared her to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, and combat simply represented another form of crisis requiring immediate, effective responses based on available information. Sarah's unconventional approach to defensive fighting proved surprisingly effective against experienced attackers. Her positioning prioritized fields of fire that would inflict maximum casualties on advancing rebels, while providing maximum protection for her own position. She coordinated her defensive fire with Victor's remaining guards to create crossfire zones that made rebel advances extremely costly. Most importantly, she maintained communication coordination. Even while directly engaged in combat, the battle reached its climax when Kozlov personally led a final assault designed to break through the compound's remaining defenses and seize the medical supply warehouse. This attack represented the rebels' last opportunity to achieve their objectives before casualties made continued fighting impossible. Sarah found herself directly opposed to the rebel leader whose forces had killed several local healthcare workers and threatened to cut off medical supplies to dozens of villages. Sarah's response to this final assault demonstrated how completely she had evolved from civilian administrator to combat leader. She coordinated defensive positions, directed tactical fire, and made real-time decisions about resource allocation, while maintaining communication with outside contacts who were providing intelligence about rebel reinforcements and escape routes. Her multitasking abilities and crisis management experience proved invaluable for managing complex tactical situations. The turning point came when Sarah identified an opportunity that Victor, focused on immediate defensive concerns, had missed. Rebel casualties and communication disruption had created a situation where a well-timed counterattack could potentially break their remaining cohesion and force a general withdrawal. However, this opportunity required rapid coordination between defensive positions and precise timing that would be extremely difficult to achieve. Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the engagement. She volunteered to personally coordinate and participate in a counterattack against rebel positions. Victor initially refused, but Sarah's demonstrated tactical abilities and intimate knowledge of compound layout and rebel positions made her arguments compelling. The counterattack would represent the culmination of her transformation from humanitarian coordinator to combat leader. Sarah's counterattack plan represented a complete reversal of conventional defensive doctrine, but her analysis of the tactical situation had identified a brief window where aggressive action could achieve decisive results. The rebels had suffered significant casualties during their failed coordinated assault. Their communication network remained disrupted, and several key leaders appeared to be wounded or killed. Most critically, their remaining fighters were positioned in exposed locations that could be attacked from multiple directions. Simultaneously, Victor listened to Sarah's tactical assessment with growing amazement at her rapid evolution from civilian administrator to combat strategist. Her plan involved abandoning their prepared defensive positions and launching coordinated attacks on rebel positions from 3 different directions. This approach violated basic military doctrine about defending from prepared positions, but Sarah's analysis suggested that remaining passive would allow rebels to reorganize and mount another assault that might succeed. The counterattack required precise coordination between the compound's remaining defenders, local intelligence contacts, and tactical innovations that exploited their intimate knowledge of the terrain. Sarah had identified specific rebel positions that were vulnerable to attack from unexpected directions, but reaching those positions required movement through areas that offered limited cover. The plan's success depended on speed, surprise, and Sarah's ability to coordinate complex tactical movements while Participating directly in combat, Sarah's transformation reached its culmination when she volunteered to personally lead the most dangerous element of the counterattack. A direct assault on the rebel command position where Kozlov was coordinating his remaining forces. This position controlled the main approach to the compound and had to be neutralized before other tactical objectives could be achieved. Victor argued that this mission required his military experience, but Sarah's knowledge of local terrain and communication networks made her the logical choice. The counterattack began with Sarah, coordinating simultaneous movements from 3 different positions while maintaining radio contact with village observers who were providing real-time intelligence about rebel dispositions. Her multitasking abilities and crisis management experience proved invaluable for managing the complex tactical coordination required to execute such an ambitious plan with minimal personnel and resources. Sarah's approach to the rebel command position demonstrated how her analytical thinking had adapted to combat situations. Rather than attempting a direct frontal assault, she used her knowledge of supply routes and terrain features to approach from a direction that rebels had not anticipated or prepared for. Her movement was coordinated with diversionary attacks from other positions that drew rebel attention away from her actual approach route. The assault on Kozlov's position proved to be the most intense combat Sarah had experienced during the entire engagement. Armed with limited ammunition and facing experienced fighters who were fighting desperately to maintain their tactical positions, Sarah found herself in close-quarters combat that tested every adaptation she had made during the previous hours. Her survival depended on split-second decisions and tactical innovations that conventional military training had never covered. Sarah's most significant tactical innovation came when she realized that the rebels' defensive positions were designed to repel attacks from conventional directions, but were vulnerable to assault from areas they considered impassable or irrelevant. Using her knowledge of compound infrastructure and supply routes, she identified approach routes that allowed her to attack rebel positions from their blind spots while maintaining communication with coordinating forces. The engagement with Kozlov's command group revealed the full extent of Sarah's psychological transformation. She was no longer the civilian administrator who had been terrified by the prospect of combat just hours earlier. Instead, she had become someone capable of making lethal decisions under extreme pressure, while maintaining the analytical thinking and communication coordination that had made her effective in civilian crisis management roles. Sarah's attack succeeded in eliminating Kozlov and disrupting the remaining rebel command structure. But the counterattack's most significant impact was its psychological effect on surviving rebel fighters. They had expected to face a small group of professional security guards, but instead encountered a coordinated defense network led by someone who appeared to anticipate their movements and exploit their tactical weaknesses with remarkable effectiveness. The breakdown of rebel coordination accelerated when Sarah's counterattack eliminated several key leaders and disrupted their remaining communication capabilities. Individual fighters began abandoning their positions and withdrawing toward their vehicles, creating opportunities for Victor's positioned defenders to inflict additional casualties on dispersed targets. The coordinated rebel assault had devolved into an unorganized retreat that could be exploited by the compound's limited defensive resources. Sarah's coordination of the pursuit phase demonstrated her complete mastery of the tactical situation. She directed Victor's guards to positions where they could maximize casualties inflicted on retreating rebels, while avoiding pursuit into areas where they might be vulnerable to counterattack. Her village intelligence network provided information about rebel escape routes, allowing defenders to anticipate withdrawal movements and position themselves accordingly. The most remarkable aspect of Sarah's tactical performance was her ability to maintain strategic perspective while engaged in direct combat. She continued coordinating with outside contacts, managing medical care for wounded defenders and making decisions about resource allocation, even while personally engaging enemy fighters. Her humanitarian background had prepared her to manage multiple crisis situations simultaneously, and combat simply represented another form of complex emergency requiring immediate effective action. As rebel resistance collapsed and surviving fighters began fleeing the area, Sarah faced a decision that tested her fundamental values. The tactical situation provided opportunities to inflict additional casualties on retreating enemies, potentially eliminating them as future threats to the compound and local civilian populations. However, her humanitarian background created conflicts between tactical advantage and ethical considerations about engaging enemies who were no longer actively threatening their positions. Sarah's resolution of this ethical dilemma demonstrated how her core values had remained constant even as her tactical capabilities evolved dramatically. She chose to allow rebel survivors to withdraw without further attack, focusing instead on securing the compound and providing medical care for casualties on both sides. This decision reflected her fundamental commitment to humanitarian principles, while acknowledging the tactical realities that had forced her into combat leadership. The silence that followed the rebel withdrawal felt almost as intense as the combat that had preceded it. Sarah stood in the compound's main courtyard, surveying the aftermath of a battle that had transformed her from civilian administrator to combat leader in the span of a single morning. 20 rebel fighters lay dead or wounded around the compound, while her small defensive team had suffered only minor casualties. The mathematical impossibility of their survival was evident in every defensive position and tactical innovation that had turned certain defeat into decisive victory. Victor approached Sarah with an expression of disbelief and profound respect. In his 15 years of military experience, he had never witnessed a civilian's transformation into an effective combat leader happen so rapidly or completely. Sarah had not only survived her first exposure to armed conflict, but had demonstrated tactical abilities that many professional soldiers never develop. Her combination of analytical thinking, crisis management experience, and natural leadership had proved more valuable than conventional military training. The immediate aftermath required Sarah to shift back toward her original humanitarian role, but with a new understanding of how crisis management skills could be applied to extreme situations. Wounded rebel fighters required medical attention, compound damage needed assessment and repair, and communication with outside contacts had to be maintained despite equipment damage during the fighting. Sarah coordinated these activities with the same methodical efficiency she had brought to medical supply. Logistics. Sarah's village intelligence network proved invaluable for understanding the broader tactical situation following the rebel defeat. Local contacts reported that surviving rebel fighters had abandoned their vehicles and equipment while fleeing toward the mountain passes, suggesting they would not be capable of mounting another assault. Government forces in the region had been notified of the engagement and were moving to secure the area, but their arrival was still hours away. The most significant immediate challenge was managing the humanitarian implications of their defensive success. Several wounded rebel fighters required urgent medical attention that could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah's fundamental commitment to humanitarian principles meant she felt obligated to provide medical care, regardless of their recent status as enemies. This created complex logistical and security challenges that required careful coordination with Victor's remaining security personnel. Sarah's approach to treating wounded enemies demonstrated how her core values had remained constant despite her combat experience. She organized medical care for rebel casualties using supplies originally intended for village clinics, arguing that humanitarian principles applied to all individuals requiring emergency treatment. This decision reflected her ability to maintain ethical perspectives even after engaging in lethal combat just hours earlier. Victor's assessment of the tactical situation revealed the full scope of what Sarah's leadership had achieved. A force of 30-plus experienced fighters with superior weapons and tactical advantages had been defeated by a hastily organized defense led by someone with no military training. The rebel force had suffered approximately 20 casualties while inflicting minimal damage on defenders or their humanitarian mission. This outcome defied every conventional military assessment of their situation. The hours following the battle brought a stream of radio communications from Sarah's organization headquarters, government officials and international agencies, seeking to understand what had happened at the compound. Sarah found herself explaining tactical decisions and combat actions that she could barely believe she had executed. Her reports described defensive innovations, tactical coordination, and combat leadership that seemed to contradict everything known about civilian capabilities under extreme stress. Sarah's personal reflection on the day's events revealed the profound psychological impact of her experience. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she never suspected existed, demonstrating that ordinary individuals could rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded exceptional responses. Her humanitarian background had prepared her for crisis management, but nothing could have predicted her natural aptitude for tactical thinking and combat leadership under extreme pressure. The most significant long-term impact of Sarah's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Her success in coordinating defensive operations while maintaining humanitarian missions demonstrated that civilian administrators could contribute meaningfully to security operations. When properly supported and motivated, military analysts would later study her tactical innovations and communication strategies as examples of unconventional approaches to asymmetric warfare situations. Village healthcare workers began arriving at the compound within hours of the fighting's conclusion, seeking to understand how their medical supply network had been preserved despite the rebel attack. Sarah's decision to risk her life defending humanitarian operations had ensured that critical medical supplies continued reaching civilian populations throughout the region. Dozens of wounded civilians would receive life-saving treatment because Sarah had refused to abandon her mission when faced with overwhelming odds. The regional impact of Sarah's defensive success became apparent over the following days. Other international humanitarian organizations learned that civilian facilities could be effectively defended against rebel attacks, encouraging them to maintain operations in contested areas rather than evacuating when threatened. Sarah's example influenced policy decisions that preserved humanitarian assistance for thousands of civilians who might otherwise have been abandoned during the conflict. Government military officials arrived at the compound 2 days after the battle, expecting to find evidence of a professional military operation that had been misreported as civilian defensive action. Instead, they discovered that Sarah's tactical innovations and unconventional defensive strategies had achieved results that conventional military units might have struggled to accomplish with superior resources and training. Her analytical approach to combat problems had produced solutions that defied standard military doctrine. Sarah's transformation from humanitarian coordinator to combat leader became a subject of intense interest for military psychologists and tactical analysts studying human performance under extreme stress. Her ability to maintain humanitarian values while engaging in lethal combat provided insights into how ethical frameworks could survive and even enhance performance in crisis situations that seemed to contradict fundamental peaceful principles. The personal cost of Sarah's experience remained difficult to assess in the immediate aftermath. She had killed multiple enemy fighters and made tactical decisions that resulted in numerous casualties, actions that conflicted with her peaceful background and humanitarian training. However, she had also preserved humanitarian operations that saved dozens of civilian lives and demonstrated that ordinary individuals could rise to extraordinary challenges when protecting vulnerable populations. 6 months later, Sarah received recognition from multiple international organizations for her actions during the compound defense. However, she continued working in humanitarian logistics, applying lessons learned during her combat experience to improve crisis management and emergency response procedures. Her experience had proven that the analytical thinking, coordination skills, and ethical frameworks developed in humanitarian work could enhance performance in virtually any crisis situation. Sarah's story became an inspiration for civilian aid workers operating in dangerous environments worldwide. Her example demonstrated that humanitarian personnel were not helpless victims when faced with violence, but could develop effective responses that preserved both their missions and their lives. Most importantly, her experience proved that ordinary courage, applied intelligently and persistently, could overcome seemingly impossible odds when protecting causes greater than individual survival. The 20 rebel fighters who died attacking Sarah's compound had expected to face token resistance from a small security force protecting civilian administrators. Instead, they encountered a defensive network led by someone whose commitment to humanitarian principles had evolved into tactical capabilities that none of them had anticipated. Sarah Martinez had proven that heroism emerges not from military training or aggressive instincts, but from ordinary individuals who refuse to abandon their responsibilities when faced with extraordinary challenges.